I think that's one of the hardest things to do, is to like carve off that mental energy to say, I'm not just going to plant the seeds to grow the food that I'm going to eat tomorrow. I'm going to take some of that. I'm going to plant things that are going to take months to come to fruition and grow more abundantly than the seeds that I'm planting today.
Welcome to the Exponential Growth Podcast, where we demystify what it takes to break into tech. I'm your host, James Hudnall, and my goal is to highlight real-life examples of people with non-traditional backgrounds moving into careers they love, so you can too. Hey everyone, today I'm joined by Kirsten Lum, founder and chief product officer at Storytellers AI, a consultancy focused on democratizing practically applied data science across multiple industries. Before that, Kirsten spent time in Expedia and also worked her way up the ranks at Amazon, becoming a data science senior manager. Kirsten, welcome to the Exponential Growth Show.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to dive into your story, but before we do that, Kirsten, can you maybe briefly talk a little bit about what you do at Storytellers AI today?
Yeah. I actually have a title update for you. I'm CTO. We've changed my title to CTO. So, which is an interesting story we can get into this time as well. But I'm the CTO of Storytellers AI. That means that I oversee all aspects of engineering, data science, product development, and product delivery for our clients. And Storytellers itself is a consultancy that helps smaller organizations. You can think of nonprofits, local government, small business, education, to use the tools of data science that have really been only adopted by like the Fortune 200. So it's helping those organizations to stand up a data science practice within their organization and actually see the benefits of machine learning and AI.
Yeah, no, I love that. And that's definitely, I think, at the forefront with generative AI. I know that's all the buzz at LinkedIn, and seemingly everybody that I talk to. I cheated a little bit and I listened to the presentation that you gave at the University of Washington, Tacoma on being an outlier, how unique life experiences are an asset in data science careers. And I have a feeling you probably agree with me that unique life experiences translate to more than just data science careers, probably tech writ large, or just about anything that people venture down. And I think I would love to go there, and I definitely don't want you to repeat all of what you said in that conversation, but maybe we can time box a portion of our time today to diving into your own unique story. So why don't you take us back to growing up in Washington? What was that like?
Yeah, happy to do it. And to give a framework, I was thinking about like how this long arc, how could I like put a framework around this arc? By any chance, are you watching Foundation?
I am. Show? Yes, I think, so my wife and I are caught up completely.
Amazing. Okay, so I'm not going to spoil anything for the listeners, but there's this concept of the crises, right? Like the first crisis, the second crisis. So I thought I'm going to frame this up as like this story from growing up in a farm in rural Washington all the way to being the CTO of this data science company is kind of 3 different crises is what I'll describe it. So I'm going to walk through each of those different crises, the moments where I felt like there was this inflection point, and I'll kind of mark it like, here's my first crisis.
I love it. This is the first time psychohistory has found its way onto Exponential Growth, but I absolutely love it. Let's go.
So good. So kind of setting the stage, I grew up in a rural part of Washington, southeast Washington. My family has a farm there, wheat and cattle. That's a place that I consider home. I moved around Eastern Washington a lot as a child. That's where I consider home. And if you had told me growing up that I would call myself a scientist when I was older, I would have been appalled. I would have been absolutely appalled. And you know how in the 90s everyone was like obsessed with the right brain, left brain thing, and are you right brained or are you left brained? Which is, by the way, no one is just one or the other. But we really thought so. And I was all in on I'm left brained. I'm creative. I loved writing. I loved reading, art. I was in theater all through high school, music, just completely left brained kind of person. Hated math. I've heard that a couple times on your show. People saying, I just hated math growing up. And so if that person, I would have been like, what I want to do, I want to be an artist. I want to be a writer. And even all through, elementary school, high school, and even into college, one thing I really got interested in right before I went to college was learning languages. And so what I ended up deciding is I'm going to learn Japanese. I'm going to be a Japanese major. That's what I want to do as a career. So it just sort of like captured me right at the end of high school. And I was like, that's my career path. There's only one school in Washington really that teaches Japanese at a high enough level to where you could have a career in it, and that's at the University of Washington. So I had started my education at Eastern Washington University, which is kind of a state school, and then transferred to UW my junior year. And my first Japanese class at the UW, I was like 1 point above failing. It was so bad. The difference, I was just like, I was flailing at this class. The difference between the two schools was too big, and the complexity level, I was just not able to keep up. And I remember like this moment, this is like, funny enough, this is maybe even the first crisis. There might be 4 crises, by the way,
okay.
I'm realizing. But maybe this first crisis is like this thing that I thought I was going to do, I was going to be a Japanese major, is like not working out. And I remember taking a semester off, and I was really discouraged. I was working full time. I was working my way through college. So I didn't have a lot of time to like think. And I remember one day I just randomly got on a bus, and I ended up in downtown Seattle, and I ended up at the Seattle Library. And if you've never seen what the Seattle Library looks like, it is an absolutely amazing building. It's beautiful architecture. It's like many stories. You can go up to like this tower at the top. It's gorgeous. And I stepped in, and I was like, I'm going to be a librarian. Like, that was like, I had this moment of like that extreme clarity. Like, you feel like, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a librarian. Well, what a lot of people don't know is that librarians have master's degrees. So like a library science degree is actually a master's degree.
Wow.
And so I needed to get a bachelor's degree in order to like pursue this new dream that I had of being a librarian. But, and so I was like, what degree would work? English would be a good degree. Love reading, love writing, let's do English. And that was, I think, the time that I most saw this shift towards seeing science as interesting and creative versus like cold and calculating like it had felt growing up. Okay. And the reason for that was I was trying to get through my bachelor's degree without taking a math class. And there's a way to do that. Here's the hack. Math fulfills quantitative reasoning. And if you look at like the course catalog, there's a whole bunch of other things that fulfill quantitative reasoning that people don't know, including classes like dinosaurs, which I took, weather, which I took, logic, probably actually the class that I use the most, like ongoing class on logic, but also space science. Wow. Fulfilled that. And I took this class just on space science, and I was like fascinated by it. I also picked up like Carl Sagan's work. If you've read Carl Sagan, so fascinating the way that he just like describes this science. And I was like, this is amazing. I would love to do something in this field. I want to be a librarian at the Jet Propulsion Lab down in California. Like, that's what I want to do. So I was taking all of these like space science classes, and it turns out they also had science fiction classes at the UW. And so I was like, I ended up getting a specialization in science fiction with my English degree. So that's where like the seeds were planted for me. Yeah. But when I graduated with my degree, there was a period of time where, like, okay, I need to prepare for getting this master's degree. I don't have a lot of money for it, so I need to work. I need to, like, you know, put all my application together. And I was working at a grocery store. I was actually working at Whole Foods down in Westlake by Amazon, funny enough. But my job, I was working in the where the cut fruit, where you see those walls of cut fruit. That was what I was doing. But to prep that, you have to be in a freezer. So I was walking to work. Sun's barely coming up, walking to work, working in a freezer all day. And by the time I get out, the sun's going down. Whoa. Like, even no sunlight for an entire day. And I was just like, I've got to get out of here. You know, like I don't even think I could make it to like getting back into school doing this for long enough. It just was like crushing. So
a lot of people there, I feel like, would either permanently give up or give up for a while. And I'm curious, I don't think you gave up, you know, jumping to the steps that you made next, but what was your mindset like, and what helped you get through that time? And maybe you were getting to that anyway, but I did want to double click on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I will say that for people that are living in the scenario where like I was, where you are barely making it through every month, like you're down to like negative $30 every month in your bank account, and like on food stamps, and doing everything that you can to survive. It's so hard to carve off a slice of your mental energy to invest in something that's going to change the trajectory of your life. I think that's one of the hardest things to do, is to like carve off that mental energy to say, I'm not just going to plant the seeds to grow the food that I'm going to eat tomorrow. I'm going to take some of that. I'm going to plant things that are going to take months to come to fruition and grow more abundantly than the seeds that I'm planting today. It's so hard to do that, but that is the critical, like, if there is a little crack of light where you can see, I'm going to hold on to whatever lifeline I have and use that to think about planting for the future. That's the hard work of getting out of those scenarios. And I can say for sure, it was dire for a while, you know? And so I have a lot of empathy for people that are in that situation. And that's part of why, to your point, sharing these stories is so important. Like, you can have a little crack of light, and you can hold on to that, and you can grow it. And it's going to take time, and it's going to take more effort than you think that you can expend. But that will grow fruit.
Yeah, no, it's worth the effort. So please, I didn't mean to interrupt your story. Please continue.
No.
You're in the freezer cutting fruits and veggies. So what happens next?
In the dark, One of my friends that I went to school with was like, I was telling her about how I was just like at the end of my abilities to like keep doing this every day. And she's like, well, you should come. I just started working at this startup. You should come interview. And she had been in my English program, and they were doing some sort of marketing, which I'd never really understood what that was. But I would do almost anything at that point to like make a change. And so got my resume together, had never written a resume before, went in, should very much not have gotten this job. The GM of the startup was out that week, so I interviewed with someone else. They offered me the job. If the GM had been there, would not have received this job offer. So there's a little bit of that right place, right time, but at the same time, still intentionally taking the shot. At a certain point, shots on goal really, really matters, because one of those shots might make it in despite all odds, you know? So that was how I got this job at a startup. And we were doing SEO. That was back in the early 2010s when SEO was like, you know, really growing, and we were doing infographics and link building for infographics. And this was the first time, I mean, again, I grew up in a very rural place. This was the first time I'd even been exposed to the inside of a business, like how a business operates. And I was learning, like on the job, like, what is marketing? Why are we building links? What is it for? What does it like do for this business that we're doing that? And what I found was that I was able to like sink my teeth into this idea that I could put effort into a certain part of this organization and it would yield something for that organization that was valuable. Like I could grasp that, just like that applies to pretty much, you know, anywhere that you've been. It's like, you know, you can spend your time, but it was disproportionate, right? Like my hour cutting fruit yielded much less to that organization than my hour doing link building for this organization.
Right. So
I started seeing how like a business is sort of like a process, and how this was a part of building that organization. But here is, you know, this might actually go back to your question about like, how do you keep going in those moments of where you're just making it through? And what I found in that role, I had this conversation with the GM when he was back. And the reality is that being in survival mode for a long time, I think had embedded in me this feeling of being an underdog in a very negative way. Like if there's something that I'm not able to do, it's because I wasn't trained properly. I didn't have the opportunity that I needed to learn it well. And so I was resisting being taught how to be excellent. And this idea, I roughly call that phenomenon learned helplessness, right? When you have learned helplessness, like bad things have happened to me for a long time. Things have been really hard for a long time, a lot of times out of my control. And therefore, when you get the opportunity that actually does have the potential to change your life, sometimes there's this block of like taking that shot. And I remember this is actually what I was considering my first crisis. Is like, even though it feels like, oh, I made it. I'm now working at the startup and I'm out of the freezer and whatever. There is another moment that comes right after that where you have to choose to be a beginner that fails repeatedly and allows people around you to correct you and say, that wasn't right. You didn't do it right. And here's how you do it. Yep. And if you're really fortunate, those people around you care about you in the way this GM like cared about the people in this organization and is actually trying to help each and every one of them to become better independently and thus become a better organization. Yeah. And so that was my first moment at that startup where it was like, hey, you could go right back to where you were if you don't choose to be humble and teachable and learn this new skill that you need to learn.
Did you appreciate that at that time? And the reason I ask is it seems counter to a lot of what we see on social media and elsewhere where people, you know, they have their pride and they don't want to be told how to do things and they're afraid to look vulnerable. So could you appreciate this at this point?
I will say when it was placed in front of me directly that way, I have so much gratitude to my past self for recognizing that moment for what it was. Because prior to that moment, I was not a very teachable person, was not very humble. I definitely resisted when people would tell me I was doing something wrong or when I made a mistake, like the defensiveness, like all of that like natural reaction, that survival mode of like you have to defend yourself really would come up. And that was the crux of that conversation was like, look, that's what you're doing. That's not a strategy that's going to work long term. Yeah. And if you want to choose to continue down this path, that's got to change. Yeah. And so I'm so grateful. I'm grateful that conversation happened. And I'm grateful that I didn't in that moment like just close down because I very easily could have gone right back to working in a freezer. That could have been the way the story went.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. And so I assume that you leaned into that at the time, even if maybe you didn't fully appreciate it at that point. And so how did your next steps, I guess, play out after having that conversation?
Yeah, so that really set me down this path of like, okay, what does it mean to be humble and teachable? What does it mean to understand what excellence is in what I'm doing here? Like that there is a discipline here that I can learn and get better at. What does that mean? And so one of the things that I loved about working at this organization was, especially the way that the GM was managing this organization, he's always looking for, you know, the iron triangle. He's like, there's always like 3 factors and like you can get 2 of the 3, but not the third, right? But breaking the iron triangle is like, if you could break that third constraint, something opens up in terms of scale that just like makes any organization or process like faster or higher scale than other organizations in this space. So when you think about like with SEO, there's this value chain of like, you need to identify something that people are willing to talk about online because that's the only way they're going to link about it. Then you need to build content that's high quality in order to like capture the people who are talking about these things attention. Then you need to know who to reach out to in that space to say, are you willing to link to our infographic about this topic? And then that includes both like following up with people that don't respond or answering questions to people who don't respond. And then finally going out and saying, okay, yes, they did place a link and we can record that as in part of our KPIs for, you know, link building. And when you think about that process, the thing that doesn't scale is all the people in there, right? Like if it's one person that's doing all of this, it's just that there's no way to scale up that number past a certain point. You just hit a ceiling. It's like, okay, well, there's only so many hours in the day. Even if you're working startup hours, there's only so many hours in the day. So the question is, how do you break that iron triangle of like increasing the number of links we're building, but in a way that we don't have to scale it with the same number of humans? You're not only scaling it with like another Kirsten doing the same thing. And so I was asked to build this process to like, how could you think of scale? And I ended up building this workflow that involved both how we did research into the folks that we were targeting with the content, how we did outreach in a scaled way using both technology and contractors to scale part of this out. And then what is the process that everyone needs to follow, like the pieces of the Swiss watch that need to be like turning it just the right way to like make this outcome happen. And I built this process out and it ended up breaking like company records for how many links we were able to build because it broke part of that iron triangle in terms of scale. So we ended up building like 2,500 links in a year with some of those links are coming from like Wall Street Journal and like NASA, which was cool, or like Discovery. And so I'd felt like I that was my first taste of like, okay, you can study a discipline like this. You can turn something into a discipline. You could study it. You can innovate in it. And then you can see an outcome that's improving. And that was responding to that crisis moment. Like, be teachable, learn, be humble. And this is something that can happen out of that. You can build these processes that change the direction of an organization. So that was where I was like, okay, this process thing, this like data thing, I think is something that I like, especially understanding like there's a funnel here and how do we need to manage this funnel and think of the drop off in the different points and what does that mean for what we put in the top of the funnel. And that was where I was like, okay, I think I get this discipline.
Yeah, foreshadowing of things to come. And I have two quick questions there. The first one is, what process did you use to figure out how to put this system together? And part two to that question is, this sounds very logical and analytical and maybe counter to your earlier point of you thinking that you're more left-brained. So yeah, I guess those a two-part question there. How'd you do it? And could you appreciate that maybe you weren't left-brained at that point and maybe more of the whole package?
Yeah, it's such a good question because I don't know that I recognized at the time how the logic and the creativity are completely combined in process development. That process development itself is this combination of creativity and logic that I find it's now my favorite thing, as we'll learn later. But like that combination of, there was someone, and I'm sorry I'm blanking on her name, but the way she described it is like, I can see, she was talking actually about farming, funny enough, farming processes. And she was like, I can see it, like almost like a top down, like you're looking at like a game board. I can see it and I can visualize how things move from one place to another. And I can simulate it in my mind and then understand, oh, I need to add a step in here to affect this error or whatever it is. Yeah. And I found that's core to where I see those talents coming together and how I work is being able to do that visualization of systems. I'd never done it before. Yeah. And but being asked to do it and being willing to be wrong in doing it and willing to try to be excellent, even though it hurts when you try to be excellent and you fail. Yeah. Like I realized that was actually something that maybe I enjoy the most is building processes and scaling processes that way.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. That sounds very similar to what I think Jocko Willink refers to as zooming out, detaching, and appreciating the situation. So maybe a different version of that, just at a systems level.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I do think that like almost like a meta, like if you can, you're doing something on the ground, but if you can also be meta about watching yourself doing it and like how does this turn into like a system? Yeah.
Course correct totally along the way without getting too far zoomed out, because then that could just get messy. So was this the first or the second crisis that we averted?
So we averted the first crisis. Technically, okay. I mean, there's the crisis of my Japanese degree, which I hadn't counted, but this is actually what I consider my first crisis. I could have just, gone right back into where I was. But instead we went this direction, which funny enough about the first crisis, I've been talking about how impactful this, the leader of this organization was to me in developing, understanding this reality. It was a little bit after that, like one day, it was like we'd been coworkers for a long time, and one day it was like something like clicked, and we were like, this works. Like, this whole thing works really well. And long story short, he and I started dating. Because of the way startups work, it was like immediately like, okay, that means I am leaving the startup. Like, we're not going to do the like coworkers dating thing. And so then you think about that as another like greenfield. Okay, what do I do now? Now I've got this idea that I can choose to be teachable and choose a direction and work to have some expertise in that. Where should I point that? What have I learned about this process, and where should I point that ability? And as I mentioned, I love this sort of like data component, the like analysis of the process and things like that. And I liked the marketing. I was like, marketing ops is kind of what that ended up looking like. And someone that When You Knew was hiring for marketing ops. And so we looked at the job description. This is a skill that I can't overstate if you can find someone that has the skill or you can develop the skill, is a huge lever, which is analyzing a job description to understand what skills you need to have a certain job. So you look at marketing ops roles and you analyze those job descriptions and say, okay, I need to know SQL, I need to know Excel, and then I can draw on my experience of having built marketing ops processes in order to talk about those in my resume bullet points and like having experience in marketing. And so that's what we did for about a month. We like analyzed these job descriptions, pulled out the skills. There wasn't even Coursera at that time. Wow. So I was reading like W3 School's SQL documentation. It was brutal. But like I learned enough SQL to get through that job interview and land a job at Expedia doing marketing ops. And that's where really, now that my whole job was data, that's where I really understood like this is something that I love. Contrary to what I would have expected, I love data. I love, even though it involves statistics and math and like spreadsheets, this is my jam. Never would have thought. And so that was where I started at Expedia.
I think you briefly touched on it, Kirsten, but can we really drill into the, I don't know if you call it a two-part framework, but basically you kind of talked about identifying the skills and then basically proving skills. I remember this distinctly from the talk that you gave before, and I really want the audience to understand that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I have to really credit, so I'm gonna spoil a little bit of the ending, but I did end up marrying the guy who has to tell you the jam, Wing Yu, he's my husband. And he had, for all of college, spent Saturdays just helping people like do their resumes. He'd done it for many years. I can say if you want to help your community and people around you, helping them to get a job is actually one of the biggest levers that you have. And so he had built that skill of understanding how to craft a resume such that people get job interviews and jobs. And so that framework, this framework that I'm quoting in that, is largely what I learned from him and like refined through being a manager of people thereafter. All right, so this framework for how to craft a resume, especially in a case like my case where like I've got an English degree that I graduated from like a year before I'm applying for this job. So I have a year of experience. And my degree was not anything related to the job that I'm applying for. And so the process that we took, this is how I would describe the framework around that, which is a resume is meant to be an artifact that answers questions for the person reading it. But what you have to understand is that people like to replace, and in fact, this is a quote from Daniel Kahneman, one of my favorite quotes from him. The sum total of my research, Daniel Kahneman's research, is that people replace hard questions with easy ones. So when you think about a resume as a tool for answering questions for a hiring manager, they are asking things like, what school did you go to, right? Like your education. But actually that's an easy question that's replacing a harder question. That harder question is, are you up to date on the leading edge of this field? That's what education does for you, is that it trains you with skills, and it especially helps you to understand what the leading edge of this, skill set is. And then a second easy question that's asked on a resume that is asking a hard question is like, what degrees do you hold? So I had English degree. But the harder question that it's really trying to answer is, do you have the skills I'm looking for?
Right.
And then the last example of that would be, what companies have you worked for? That's an easy question that's masking the hard question of, have you applied your skills to solve similar problems to the ones that I have?
Yep.
And so if you realize that that's what's happening when someone's reading a resume, is that they're asking easy questions that you don't have an easy answer to because you're non-traditional in your background, and you understand what the hard question is that easy question is masking, just answer the hard question directly. So for example, are you up to date on the leading edge of this field? You can write on Medium. Blogging is a great way of doing that. Having a sort of a personal like website, blog, Medium, LinkedIn, where you're talking about what's happening in your field is a way of answering that hard question. Yes, I'm up to date on the leading edge of this field. Or do you have the skills I'm looking for? A GitHub portfolio of projects that you've done, especially in data science, things like, you actually built models that are predicting something and you can show outputs of that, for instance. And then the other is, have you applied your skills to solve similar problems? Those are things like you can start a side business. You can have internships. You can also use portfolio projects for that. And that way you're actually answering the questions that they have without sidestepping and using the easy answer that's not available to you. It may be available to your peers, but it's not available to you. So you have to like really think about that hard question.
Yeah.
There's one other part of this, and because you can talk about this for a long time, but the process for it really is as simple as I mentioned. It's deceptively simple, which is finding job descriptions, distilling them into skills, and mapping them using those hard questions. So like with a data scientist, breaking down, I look at 6 data science job descriptions and find the common skills among all of them. They're all going to say Python, almost all of them. Some of them will say R, but ignore that.
Not
just
really.
kidding. But, but like, they're going to say Python. A lot of them are going to say SQL. And a lot of them are going to look for you having trained a model and put it in production. Figure out what that takes and actually do it. And say, look, I've done it. Here's the GitHub portfolio. It's right here. I can do those things. And that then is how you can leap over, I didn't go to MIT. I don't have a CS degree. That's how you leap over it. You don't answer the easy question. You answer the hard one.
Without taking us too far off track, I am curious, once you came to that realization, did it ever backfire when you were first using that approach of answering the hard question when they weren't asking necessarily the hard question yet?
I will say this is the place where it is tough. Part of why it's tough is because it sits right next to imposter syndrome. This is why it's so tough. When you are self-taught or you have a non-traditional background, sometimes you don't know what you don't know.
For sure.
And when you don't know what you don't know, you also don't know how important that thing is relative to all the other knowledge in the space. For instance, someone might ask me a question about a particular deep learning methodology. And at the beginning of being a data scientist, I may not understand that that's deep cut knowledge and that there's a way to redirect that question towards knowledge that's more applicable to the day-to-day. To show that I understand what you mean by asking me this question about deep learning. No, I do not do that kind of deep learning. And here's why I don't do that kind of deep learning. Because actually, tree-based algorithms are the most applicable across different problem sets. So I've really spent my time becoming an expert in tree-based algorithms, right? Like, then you can see how that question, which is really like, okay, do you know all these skills? No, I don't have that skill. But what I wouldn't know is then it sits in your imposter syndrome, like, oh man, I didn't know that question about deep learning. I must not be the data scientist that I thought I was. And so that's where I would say that's the hardest part, is that you may have like the big rocks in the space and you may not know what's a big rock versus a pebble versus like sand. And you may not know enough about it to redirect in that way to get people back into like, what is the big rock? Like helping them think in the big picture. Like, yeah, if you need a deep learning expert, not going to be me.
Right.
And like that's okay. Because that's not what you are. You're something else that's equally valuable.
Yeah. No, I love that reframing. And I had adopted a similar approach in some of the early interviews I did, where you had mentioned something to the point of somebody asked you maybe about a more traditional role. And I don't know if you answered it directly or you just basically danced around the fact that if they were looking for a more traditional person, you were not that person. But if they were looking for someone that had this unique perspective and, you know, this work ethic and the motivation and drive, then you were their pick. I've used that same approach to great success in the past. And I just wanted to highlight that because I feel like that, coupled with the reframing that you just covered, I feel like you can't lose.
It's true. Because the ability to think on your feet in that way shows a mastery of the space that a point skill does not replace. Like, those are not equal. Having a point skill is nice, but having a mastery of the space is far more valuable because it makes you so nimble and you can figure out like, oh, I'm missing this point skill I need for this particular role. I'm going to go get that skill, right? That ends up being easier than like needing to develop the mastery of the space that you weirdly, I find people with non-traditional backgrounds have to do that because they're learning it on their own. They're figuring out what the space is.
All right, let's zoom back to Expedia. What was that like?
Yeah. So this is now we're heading into second crisis. So second crisis is about, I've been in this role for, I think maybe like 1 or 2 years at this point. Really gotten into SQL, Tableau, like marketing ops processes, like understanding metadata. I suddenly realized that like metadata was my jam, and understanding like how do you tag things and how do you attach metadata to those tags so you understand what part of your marketing is working and what part's not. That ended up being something I really love doing. And about 2 years in, I was working kind of alongside this organization that was doing SEM, like it was SEM like pay per click bidding. So you imagine you have a link up somewhere and you pay that website a certain amount of money every time someone clicks through a link. Okay. And you have to decide, how much am I willing to pay for every link click? And they had someone on the marketing side whose responsibility was to set those bids, leave, and they asked me to fill in while they were backfilling that person. So I was like, great, I can do that. It's really data manipulation, so right in my wheelhouse. But I go to do this process, and it's this massive spreadsheet with like 16 tabs, and it takes a person about 10 hours a week to refresh this spreadsheet. And and I mean 10 hours of like clicking, waiting for it to refresh, making sure it didn't crash, checking the formulas. Okay, now calculate the next thing, copy and paste this over, like 10 hours of that.
Wow.
And I was like, this is mind numbing. Like, I work in Excel every day, and even I was like, no, thank you.
Yeah.
So actually, someone who'd worked at Expedia before, was friends of Wing You. You know, we were at dinner with him, and I was explaining. He was asking like, "How's Expedia going?" He'd been there, and I was kind of explaining this project that I have. He's like, "That sounds like it should be a Python script." I was like, "Oh, I'd never really been around Python before, and so I didn't know what it meant that it should be a Python script." So I was like, "Okay, well, I'll learn Python and I'll like turn this into a Python script." So I asked my boss. I was like, "Hey, can I try and build this into a Python script?" Like, you know, this my mentor said that would be a good application. He's like, no, I don't know that I could like inspect a piece of code the way I can inspect this spreadsheet. And so I'm not really comfortable with that. It's like, great. Went ahead and continued to use this spreadsheet. But on my like nights and weekends, I learned enough Python. I picked up Python for Data Analysis, which basically is about the Pandas library. Really great book. My first Python book ever. Still reference it a lot. And built a Python script that did the same calculations, outputted all the same outputs as this Excel spreadsheet, and it ran in 8 seconds. And I was like, holy smokes, 10 hours. I just got 10 hours of my week back, like, which is incredible. I go and show it to my boss. I'm like, look, you can inspect everything the exact same way that you were with this Excel spreadsheet, but this runs in 8 seconds. And he was like, I'm sold. Yes. Okay. And that moment, what I used that 10 hours for was inspecting the bidding landscape of that website that we were bidding on. And so I was able to look at the strategy for how we were setting the bids and actually change that strategy and grow the partnership in a way that I absolutely would not have been able to do if I needed to spend 10 hours in that spreadsheet. And so because of that, the whole department actually switched from using Excel spreadsheets for this. So think there's 10 people, each spending 10 hours refreshing spreadsheets, or however many people, and they completely switched to using Python bidding algorithms because it saved so much time and gave the time back to these individuals to think about strategy and what they were doing with these organizations. And that was my like second moment where I was like, this is what it is. Like, I've been sort of like circling the bullseye. This is dead center. Like,
you found it.
Optimizing a process, I can build a script by myself that makes this big of a difference to an organization. Yeah, I was hooked.
Talk about creating leverage. I mean, leveraging that across the entire department, now using your Python script to automate what used to take 10 hours a person. And so I would think that whoever your manager was at the time, oh my God, we got to promote Kirsten. She's going to be in charge of the next thing. And you would just keep working your way up that way. But I don't think that's how your story played out. So what happened next? Yeah.
Interestingly, I worked there for about another year, I think, and it was in similar capacities. They built an organization that was over this bidding strategy. So they like took the seed of this idea that like, we can automate it in this way, and they actually built a new team that helped with that. So a lot of that year was spent like really diving into how to build software around paid search bidding. But what funny enough, coming back to my like, I'm going to be a librarian moment, One of the things that was always on the lookout for was working with Kindle at Amazon, because if you were a librarian in space, you would have a Kindle. That's like science fiction libraries. Yep. And so a role came up that sounded really cool. It was a product manager for device engagement. And it was a brand new team. I was going to be like the second or third hire. And they were building this new team that's like, okay, how do we, this was even in the job description, like Amazon intentionally sets the prices of their devices low because they don't want to make money on the sale of the device. They make money because it's integrating Amazon into, your life. But they hadn't had a team until that point whose whole job was to look at that, to say, how is that happening? How are people becoming more integrated into the Amazon ecosystem because they're buying these Amazon devices? Like, that's very, very cool data problem. Yeah. So interviewed for that job, got that job, and the very first thing, of course, come in the door, and I'm like, okay, great. Where's our data live about like device usage and purchases and all of the ancillary things around these devices? And there wasn't any.
Wow.
And so that was like, again, to like underscore this idea that I had built this skill that was valuable even to one of the biggest companies in the world.
Yeah.
Hadn't solved it to where they no longer needed someone like me to get down into the guts, and like think about instrumentation and data strategy. And so even though I thought I was coming into like a more marketing type role where I was doing engagement for devices, it very quickly became a data role where I was working with software engineers to identify how to do instrumentation, working with the various teams over various services like how much have you read or what apps have you purchased. These are all these different teams where I'm going to work with all of them separately to kind of collect this data landscape that becomes device engagement. And I would say in that process, one of the things that happens is if you become good at data, you will almost never be able to get away from doing a data role because it's so needed that once people figure out that you can do it, they'll give you the responsibility. So like sense. That is and I talk about this as like I call it the licorice jelly bean idea, which is there are these tasks that almost no one wants to do. Okay, first I have to start with the analogy. Like back before COVID, there used to be the bowl of jelly beans, and then people would come by and they would pick up the jelly beans and like, they pick up the red one and then and then they pick up the like, maybe they'll eat a few of the orange ones. And the ones that are always left are the licorice ones. Always. Yeah, there's like a bowl at the end of the day. There's a bowl of licorice jelly beans. And if you are someone who likes licorice jelly beans, you will always have jelly beans because no one else will eat them. So it turns out that instrumentation and data tend to be licorice jelly beans. Like there's not a lot of people that are like, I love this. I love getting data and organizing it and understanding why it's broken and how it's broken and fixing it. That is a black licorice jelly bean problem. And so if you can find those, I highly recommend it.
Yeah.
So that's what happened to me is I ended up having responsibility for these things that people are like, look, that's like plumbing. I don't want to work on the plumbing stuff. I want to work on the cool like front end stuff. And not only that, when people saw this idea that when you have a lot of experience in a lot of different areas, where now you can think, I have all this experience before I even started in tech, then I have my experience in marketing, my experience in marketing ops, my experience in like bidding algorithms, my experience in instrumentation. And the reality is in tech, when you have that breadth of experience, it allows you to interface with different organizations or different types of people pretty seamlessly. So you can talk to an engineer and kind of figure out a language to talk to each other. You can talk to a PM, you can talk to a marketer, you can talk to a business owner, and you can sort of become a little bit fungible in how you approach. That's the classic sign of a PM. Is that like when you get a good PM, the classic sign is that they are able to go in and out between different scenarios and get everyone sort of on the same page.
Yeah, you're like middleware between the engineers and the end users.
Exactly. And as much crap as PMs get, sometimes when an organization is really complex, you need the middleware. That's like, instead of the designers interfacing directly with the engineers, it's a complex enough product that it should be someone's job to where they understand the inputs and outputs of that whole system. And that's sort of all living within one person. Yeah. But what that also meant is that there's these certain types of people that are very difficult to manage without expertise, and data people are some of those. It's very common for an organization to be like, hey, I just want one analyst that's there to just like put my dashboards together, right? And they're going to report to this marketing manager. It's going to be a great learning opportunity for the marketing manager to like get into managing or whatever. But then 4 months down the line and like nothing's been delivered and nobody really knows what's going on with that data. And so they've got this person that's sort of adrift, doesn't have a community, and they'll find someone who's like, oh, who knows data that could like help that person out, and they'll pull you in. And because I knew data, that kept happening. It's like, this person's kind of marooned out here, can you pull them in and kind of give them some direction? And then a couple months down the line, can you just manage them? Can we just move that headcount under you? And so that's what happened at Amazon, is because of the fungible nature of what I was doing, and because it was kind of deep down in the guts, I kind of just eventually had this team of people that had been adopted from different parts of the organization, and we all came together to form a group that was doing data science within, by this time I was actually working in what I call Central Amazon, the mothership, which is like, it's not in any one of the little business units, it's actually kind of like center Amazon. Okay. And we were working on customer engagement for kind of Central Amazon. What's the customer journey across all Amazon's, products? And this is now the setup for the third crisis. So, third crisis. I'm now managing like a 14, I think was the size of it at the end, 14-person team. And I'm seeing, I'm seeing how impactful, if we can break the iron triangle of data science, which I'm going to pause here and actually explain that really quick. A data scientist generally is expected to produce somewhere around 3 models a year. So training 3 models a year to where they're ready for production. Maybe one of those has like a measurable uplift to the business. That would be a data science that was doing a pretty good job.
Okay.
And that uplift is probably measured in the single-digit percentages. And when you do that math, that works out for an Amazon. That does not work out for a small business, especially with the salaries that any individual data scientist would be paid. It's just like doesn't work. And so I understood from like looking at this math, I'm like, wow, that's why data science is so prevalent at Amazon, at Microsoft, at Apple, at Google, at Facebook. Like that's why it works that way, because a little bit of uplift pays for multiple data scientists. And when I'm looking at this reality, I'm like, one, eventually a lot of people start to feel like, I'm not sure that like I feel a lot of satisfaction from like making this company a little bit more money every year. And 2, I see how this would be incredibly valuable for other organizations if we could make it cheaper and higher volume. But what is hard is you need to have a process and a system for rapidly understanding the data landscape of an organization such that you could plug data science into it. It can't take 2 years, which was like, you think in the like mid 2010s, like a digital transformation of 2 years to get everyone's data into a data warehouse wouldn't be uncommon. It can't take that long. It's got to be like from the moment that you start working on it, within a month or 2, you have model outputs out the door, and not 1, like 10, right? That would be the kind of scale you would need to have in order to make this work for small business. And of course, I'm talking to like my peers now, which again, remember, this is like 10-year arc. Now my peers are like principal scientists at Amazon, coming from working in a freezer to now these are my peers. And I'm saying like, okay, how could we scale this? How could we scale this way? And people are saying it is not possible. There's no framework that approaches this problem that way. Like it's all just bespoke. It has to be bespoke. Which the problem it reminds me of is like Henry Ford and like cars prior to Henry Ford. It's like they were all artisan hand built. Like there was a person who built a whole car end to end. And Henry Ford's like, I can break that down into a repeatable system where someone has a specific task to do and they like do that task the same way every time. And then we assembly line it and I can produce way more cars that way. And so that's what was like percolating in my mind, and why we ended up starting Storytellers is because you have to approach it like Henry Ford to make it work. Everyone says it's impossible. And that's the kind of thing I love. Like, how do you break the iron triangle and make it actually work? And so I'm happy to report, like, the end of that crisis, we just submitted our first patent for the technology that we built in order to, do this for organizations, which has to do with, how do you go into messy data, completely blind, first time you're seeing it, and like actually apply a structure to it that allows you to build models on top of it. We just submitted a patent for the technology we use for that. So
congratulations.
That's what we do.
There's so much there that I want to unpack, Kirsten, and maybe just backing up a little bit in your time at Amazon. The first question I have is, can you maybe speak to the power of communication? Because I think I heard you mention in another talk that communication is one of the fastest tracks, I think, not only in being that middleware, but also in going down the management track. So I'm curious to what extent you would attribute your communication skills to your rapid ascent in Amazon. So that's the first question.
Yeah, I definitely think that is an underappreciated skill in both career development kind of generally and in kind of business, specifically, which is, and I mean, even down to the level of like in AI, how that piece is so important, because you have most of the time in these larger organizations, or even where you're trying to sort of fit two pieces of a puzzle together, one piece being people with like ML and AI expertise, and the other is people who have expertise in a domain like healthcare or education or retail, sales, marketing, whatever. You have these domain experts, and their life experiences and their skills and their abilities tend to not have a lot of overlap. An AI and ML person generally is someone who's gone to school maybe for 4 to 6 years and has a math background and has a CS background, but hasn't necessarily done the job of a marketer, hasn't done the job of a teacher, hasn't done the job of these other folks. And then same on the other side. In the domain, it's very difficult to find someone who has any expertise in having used ML. Right. And so what a person who has a little bit of expertise from the domain, as well as a little or a lot of expertise on something like ML and AI, becomes this critical part that actually can get something done. That's why the projects fall apart, is because the person who's able to build the thing and the people who have the specifications of what should be built don't have a common language to where they can share information back and forth. And a person who has a little bit of each can provide that continuity of like, okay, when a teacher says they need this is what that means in terms of requirements. Or when the ML expert is saying that the model has this type of error, this is what it means you should watch out for as you implement this model. I mean, I've seen firsthand how people teams who have that person that can translate between the expertise, the domain versus say ML or AI, those projects get done way faster with way more success than the people who don't have that common language, for sure.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Now, the other question I wanted to ask, I guess, relates to imposter syndrome. You had mentioned your peers now, when you become senior manager at Amazon, they were PhDs or principal data scientists or computer science graduates. And to preface this, the question is, how did you deal with the imposter syndrome I imagine you felt? Maybe you didn't, maybe you did. But again, before you even answer that, I want to share with the audience that I think I understand you were one of only 150 out of, 1 million employees that was selected by Amazon to be part of their, I think it's a LEAP leadership program, basically. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I don't know if maybe you want to talk about that briefly, just so we can better understand that management fast track program, just to set the table for the type, or the caliber rather, of person that you no doubt are. And then despite that, did you feel any imposter syndrome with the peer group?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this may be a little bit of a controversial answer to this question, which is, when I get down underneath, when I experience imposter syndrome, like what's happening there, what I think is happening is, honestly, there's a lot of pride. Because like imposter syndrome is this idea that I don't belong here. And when you think about belonging, it's like an inadequacy in some expectation of that group. And what's so bad about that? Like, what's so bad about not having the characteristics that other people in that group have? And it's that you will be shamed, that you will be embarrassed because you don't have the abilities or the knowledge that this group has. And the way that I approach that is a lot of humility, that like, I'm not a big deal. And, like, I'm not a big deal. And so if I'm embarrassed, the embarrassment comes from a place of feeling like I need the approval of someone and not getting it. And so I combat it by not needing the approval of people, right?
I like that.
I like it because there's one way that can be taken where it's like you start to have a chip on your shoulder, like, I don't need, whatever. But there's another way that actually ends up being like playful and joyful. That's like you're free of needing the approval of people in this space, and you're free to make mistakes and for it not to be an embarrassing experience. And like allowing myself to build the muscle of not feeling shame when I make a mistake is the strongest antidote with the best healthy outcome that I found. Just be okay with making mistakes and be humble and be like, yep, I messed up, or they didn't understand and that's okay, And that's why I think I don't experience a lot of imposter syndrome anymore, especially after okay, so I'm going to do one more analogy. This can be applied in a lot of different places I found. It's like you always have to look at the fruit of what's happening. So for me, I've done enough things where I've struck out on something, like gone out to do something, and have been able to accomplish it and measure that I've accomplished it, right? Like whenever you're doing something, you're like, what would a positive outcome here be? How would I measure that I was successful here? And then you do the thing and you measure and you say, was I successful? And if you've got a good measurement, you can say, yep, I succeeded. And when I've done that more and more, it makes me less anxious about starting to do something that I don't know how to do. Because I've been like, hey, I've been here before. I've been here 7, 8, 9, 20 times where it's a thing that I didn't know how to do. But I remember that I was able to set a criteria for success and I was able to meet that criteria for success. And I have the tools to do it. I know I have a support system of people that are able to help me. You start to feel like you're not drowning, that you're actually like setting out on an expedition each time you do that. And that's that I found is a really strong antidote to that.
Yeah, I love that take. You're treating it like an adventure and leaning into humility. And I too have had tremendous success. I like to, in a measured way, I feel like, make fun of myself. And it's not superficial, but I've also noticed that once you get comfortable doing that, at least for me, and I'm curious of your experience as well, it seems like people are more willing to engage with you, whether that be in a code review or whatnot. It seems like every interaction that I have when approaching it with that mindset seems more successful, for lack of a better word. You've experienced agree. Similar?
Yeah, especially because the reality is that almost everyone is afraid of that same thing, of being shamed for having failed. And when they see that you're not afraid of failing, and that you don't feel shame when you fail, that you feel curiosity and you feel humility and you feel this teachable feeling, they're like, oh, they're probably not going to shame me either. And that makes people feel more comfortable with you personally to say, that's how I want to be. Like, if I'm going to fail, I want to fail in front of that person. Not the other person that's very clearly like defensive and guarded, because they're so much more likely to also like project the shame.
No, I couldn't agree more. So now you are the CTO at Storytellers AI, and I guess I'm going to put myself in the position of the audience. What do you look for when you hire either a developer, data scientist? What's the ideal candidate, if there is one?
Yeah. This goes back to kind of what I just touched on before, which is looking at the outcomes. I work backwards from outcomes almost all the time. And I even use this at Amazon. We have the leadership principles at Amazon, which I actually really like, especially at the time I was there, the leadership principles that we used. And one of them that I talked about quite a bit in promo doc reviews or hiring loops was the primacy of deliver results. Deliver results is one of the Amazon principles that's as I kind of explained, like you have an activity that's meant to cause an outcome. Did your activity actually cause the outcome you intended? And was that outcome as good as you thought it would be? And that idea of like being outcome driven permeates back through to the candidate. So if they're outcome driven, that means that they're much more likely to be able to structure their projects. It's much more likely to think about what they need inputs wise going into those projects. And then they're able to self-regulate through that process to say, okay, I'm falling behind here, I need some help, or I have an opportunity to innovate here. Should I take the risk to innovate here in case that risk pays off? And so I really start with deliver results and thinking about what results someone has delivered. But I am quite creative in how I interpret. So for me, there is like a base level of skills that are really necessary to be a data scientist. That's a pretty small list. Like, you need to know Python pretty well. You need to know SQL pretty well. You need to be able to navigate sort of cloud infrastructure. And then from there, it's like, what type of data science do you do? And how can you prove that you've done that successfully over time? And that, again, could be proven the ideal way that most people prefer is that you've done it for another company and you can list that out. Like, this is the outcome that I caused, and here's how I measured that outcome was successful. Like, that's the resume bullet point. I was meant to do this, I did it this way, and this is what happened, and all of those are numbers. And then you just have 8 to 12 of those on your resume, and like, that's what I look for. Someone who's just like, these are the outcomes that I was meant to deliver, and here's how I did it. Yeah. And from there, it's like, I've hired people out of a lot of different diverse domains into other domains because that skill is fungible. And I do actually look for people who have kind of non-traditional backgrounds, because that is the signal that the meta learning has happened, right? Like, they can take the success from one area and translate it into a totally different area. Yeah. And that is really hard to teach. It's really hard to teach someone how to like abstract the learning from one place and put it to another. Yeah. But that's one of the signals is, I started out as a marketer and I made my way to being a BI. Or I started out as, in HR and actually I became a developer, like that sort of really shows that someone is able to abstract that learning all the way through to another domain, which is, it's invaluable.
Yeah, I know the audience is going to love hearing that, and they would never forgive me if I didn't ask. Are you hiring currently?
Oh, that's a good question. I will say, ask me that again in a couple months.
Okay. All right, fair enough.
That is my opaque answer to that, which is, in startup land.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have some big things that we're working on, including patents is one of the things that we're working on. And yeah, we're always excited that hockey stick happens in the near future.
Yeah. Well, you navigated the third crisis. Do you see the fourth in the near future? Or I guess you maybe necessarily can't appreciate the fourth other than knowing that it's out there.
That's right. I'm curious what it'll be, because it is always felt easier to identify it in the rear view than it is when you're in the middle of it. Like, you don't realize how much the current situation is actually this crucible moment until you're out of it and you see like, wow, I actually had the opportunity to go one way or another here. And so I'm curious what that will be. Yeah.
Kirsten, you have an amazing story. Before you get out of here, I would love to throw you in the hot seat if you're up for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. First question. What does your typical morning routine look like?
So I have 2 little girls. One's 4 and one's 2. And I'm a business owner. And part of the reason I'm a business owner is because I am the mom of 2 little girls. And so my morning routine really is focused on like my family. They wake up at about 6 o'clock and we get up and it's like breakfast and we get a little playtime in before I have to go to work. That's part of why I love owning a business, is because I have that flexibility to actually have the first few hours of the day with my family. So like yesterday we all dressed up as butterflies. That was the activity of the morning. We have these like butterfly wings. We're just like, and that's the morning activity. Or other mornings it'll be like, we'll take a walk and go find, we live kind of out in the woods, so we'll go find sticks in the woods and, play games. And I love this question because I think there's a lot of pressure to be like a super regimented, disciplined person in the morning, and I think that is important. And if it's not something that works in life, there are other things that the morning can be for that are equally valuable.
I love that answer. If money didn't exist, what do you think you would do every day with your time?
Do we have time for another analogy for this one? Because this is one of my favorite Absolutely. Analogies. This came from one of my friends who, her job, which I didn't even know this was a job, is to help people with high net worth figure out where they can donate their funds or their resources for causes that they really care about. So like it's just a very cool job.
Yeah.
And so it's like, what like lights them up, and how can they use their resources not after they die, but while they're still alive, so they can see the impact of, of giving this money away. And the analogy that she taught me was, money is like wheat. Some wheat you eat. You turn it into flour, you bake it into bread, and it's free to eat. And then some wheat is seeds for planting for the next harvest. And thinking about money as being divided into those two things, there are these concentric circles of communities that I believe, like, my attitude towards money is like, the purpose of money is to take care of these concentric circles of communities. Very center of that is like your family, your kids who depend on you, your spouse, maybe your parents, your siblings. Like, there's the very close center of your family. And then there's like your friends, people who may feel like family to you, like taking care of them. How does you increasing in resources help you to plant things that help them? And when I think about the idea of like money not existing, I'm interpreting it as like, I have infinite money.
Yes, exactly.
Rather than thinking about it as like giving people enough wheat to eat. What can we do to where everyone's harvest becomes more reliable? Like, everyone is able to plant their own seeds and grow their own, like, what they need, and then to take care of their concentric circles of communities. And I think about the analogy of like natural disasters just wipe people out. So you think about like healthcare. How do we think about, if I had infinite money, I would be thinking about pushing out that concentric circle to like the national level or the global level of like, how do you make illness less common and less destructive?
Yeah.
How do you make healthcare cheaper? Or how do you think about education, like the process of education? How do you think about that becoming more reliable for everyone, so everyone has a similar base to go on to be able to make these kinds of choices we've been talking about here? Like they have those choices and understand they have those choices and what they want to do. And if I had infinite money, it would be extending out that concentric circle of who is being cared for, and then caring for them under the auspices of how do we make it so that they're not just eating everything, like all of their wheat is going to something that they're eating, but they're able to then plant and take care of their families and their friends and their local area. That would be the dream.
That's the most altruistic answer I think we've ever had, and I appreciate that. I didn't plan on asking this as a somewhat related follow-up, but do you feel like your two children, do you feel like they are likely to go through the traditional education system? And I also understand that understanding whatever that is, 16, 18 years from now is impossible to know. And I also say this selfishly as the father of a 15-month-old, but I'm curious of your thoughts there.
So I hypothesize that education will be very different, to your point. I think education is going to change a lot, is my guess. Even if I wanted it to, I doubt that my kids would have a similar experience of education that I did, is my guess. And especially being in a rural place, where now I live in a place where like there are private schools, there's like STEM schools all around here. So I grew up where it's like there's one school, and there's like a middle school, high school, and an elementary school. Like that's it. There's one school for everyone. But even if it was an option, I think I'm willing to be creative in how we approach schools with our kids, because I can already see, like, my 4-year-old happened to be very interested in reading, and so she's reading already, and I can tell that what I experienced through school was that there's sort of a cap in the challenge, but actually where I think a lot of joy and mastery comes from is being challenged to the farthest edge that you can in what is drawing your attention, which is very hard to do in like a traditional school. And so I think it's a really important responsibility that a community has to provide education to kids. Like, it can't be a free-for-all, because it's just not realistic that everyone would have the skills and the ability to teach their own kids, right? But at the same time, where we have the opportunity to challenge kids in the directions that seems to be drawing them in, like having that flexibility to do that, I think is really important, which is one of the things I'm like, I don't know exactly what that means for like what education will look like for the kids, but I do think it probably doesn't mean, going to school from 8 to 3, Monday through Friday is my guess.
Yeah.
even if that still exists.
It'll be interesting to see how that evolves. That's what my wife and I have conversations to that effect. I'm convinced that the education system is going to be completely different by the time our little one gets ready for kindergarten. I'm not sure if it'll be quite that quick, but I don't know. We'll have to see.
I mean, you think about like what COVID did for, kids, where it like changed in the blink of an eye, like all of education was different. And I don't think it's really gone back to the way that it was. Yeah. And so, you never know whether it's forced or whether it's people start to just invest in that direction. Yeah, I'm excited to hear if we'll have AI teaching kindergartners by the time your kids
probably AI tutors. I think I forget what the service is, but that came across my Twitter feed the other day. I'm sure there are more than one companies trying to compete on that front. So yeah. All right, last hot seat question. Do you have any thoughts on Bitcoin?
Bitcoin is so interesting. As I kind of talk about the idea of money being like there's resources that you consume and there's resources that you invest, it's not obvious to me that if you have the kind of risk tolerance that would lead you to that space, that would be where I would apply it. And that's when I think about investing in Bitcoin as like an asset, that's what comes to mind. So I would say the technology itself I've been interested in terms of like the concept of the technology, I think has some applications that are untapped. I'm not sure right now that I can be the person that's like, yeah, it's just wait, we're on our way back. I don't know that we're there.
Yeah, no, fair. All right. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't today?
I will just direct people to, if you want to learn more about Storytellers and how we're
that was the next and last question I had is where can people go to find out more about you and what you're doing?
Yeah, we you can find us at Storytellers.ai is where you can learn more about what we're doing to try and bring data science to smaller and mid-sized organizations. I'm also on Twitter quite a bit at MACHSCI, which is machine learning and science kind of like combined together. And then otherwise, it's kind of like a two-part encouragement. If you're sort of in that place where you're feeling like, I've only got a little sliver of light here that I'm like holding on to, know that there are people that have been there, and that is the thing to hold on to, is the sliver of light. And then the other is that for people who are in a position to where you can help people that are there, I can say that, like, coming full circle, now being able to help people that are in that position to like change their careers, get their dream jobs, is so gratifying. And there are a lot of people like that out there. So if you know how to build resumes, if you are hiring or you like doing podcasts, for instance, if you have this knowledge, giving people that hope that they can change their circumstances by their choice and by accepting the help of people that want to help them is I can't encourage that enough.
Yeah, no, I love that. I will add all of those links to the show notes. And Kirsten, I just want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing your journey so far into tech. It is a phenomenal story, and I know the audience is going to be blown away by all the nuggets of wisdom, the concentric circles. I'd love to share some of the slides that I know we talked about offline as well. And yeah, I'm just really glad to get to know you better, and would love to bring you back in the future to see how things are progressing over at Storytellers.
Yeah, I would love to. Maybe in a couple months I'll be like, yep, we're hiring. We need a big team of data scientists. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so great.
Thanks for listening. If you got value from today's show, please consider leaving a 5-star rating and a review on Apple or Spotify. It's a free way you can support the show and help other people just like you find the story and others like it. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to follow the show on whatever podcast application you use. And most importantly, if you know someone that might be interested in breaking into tech, tell them about the show.